All right, well, let's get started. So today we're going to talk about the Syrian National Congress. So we're going back to this moment before World War I breaks out. And I like to talk about it, or I like to think about it as the moment of what if. So sometimes when I teach classes on conflict in the Middle East broadly, the question is, what are these sort of crucial moments when something else could have happened? And there's also kind of this sense that the idea of, or a lack of understanding about the idea of Palestine as it evolved over time, like what is Palestinian nationalism? Did people always want a Palestinian state? And the answer to that is no, but that's an uncomfortable thing to just say because that it's not meant to be a denial of the desire for a Palestinian state or for a state. It's that the distinction of a Palestinian state as separate and distinct from this greater ambition that existed before and during World War I really kind of evolves out of the events that take place where the Middle East gets broken up at World War I. So we're going to look at today the Declaration of Resolution, or the declaration that comes out of something called the Syrian National Congress. And it's this moment when perhaps, if we'll go to the next slide on the outline, perhaps we can think a little bit about what if the proposal that they put forward had been accepted in place of the mandate. And what if an Arab state or a great Arab state came into being, and could that have changed things drastically in terms of the kinds of questions we'd be asking about what is Palestine now? And it also gives us a lot of insight into the messiness of the politics in this moment at the breakup of World War I, the various kinds of visions that people had about how things were going to move forward, what kind of state, what kind of future they would have, who would be in power, and all these kinds of things. So what we're going to do is first kind of quickly remember a little bit about World War I and how we're going to get to the end of World War I in this Congress. So we'll talk about Arab national aspirations following World War I. We have to talk once again about the Great Arab Revolt that's come up a couple of times, this idea of Arab nationalism, and then Woodrow Wilson, the American president's 14 points, which have a really important foundation for a lot of the principles and actions that get laid out in the shaping of the Syrian Congress's declaration of what it would like. And then we'll talk specifically about the National Congress at Damascus, who was there, and then go through the document itself to talk about what they wanted. And so again, thinking about how might this have been different, how might this have created entirely different dynamics in the region relative to the relationship with the West, if this had all kind of fallen out. So if we go back to this question of World War I and what kind of been happening, a couple of things that this idea of Arab nationalism or an Arab identity had been existing since the late 19th and early part of the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire, which existed before that, had been in the 19th century centralizing its control in Istanbul. Right, things had been very sort of dispersed with lots of nodes of power throughout the empire. And by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had been trying to centralize its control, exert more power, exert more sort of sense of hegemony and control over the economic resources, the political resources, reduce the amount of sort of separatist movements and different ethnic movements that were taking place within the empire, and so on. And then this kind of, by the end of the 1890s, was really kind of strengthening, and then it sort of collapsed a little bit, and there was a loose period of time. It's getting a little overly detailed, but and then in the early part of the 20th century, a new political realignment occurred, and you got a really strong political party committed to the idea of the Ottoman Empire, with a heavy focus on the Turkish identity of the Ottoman Empire. And what this meant for a lot of people who had been training up under the Ottoman Empire, but living in and located with their power and interests in the Arab world of the empire, was that they started calling for greater Arab representation from Syria, Lebanon, what we now think of as Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. So they wanted more representation and greater autonomy from within the Ottoman system before we get to World War I. Okay, so there was already talk about what is it to be an Arab, what are the things that sort of define Arabness. There weren't necessarily separatist movements from the Ottoman Empire, but a sense that being within the Ottoman Empire still allowed for a certain amount of autonomy within different communities, ethnic communities, religious communities, and so on. And then World War I broke out. And during World War I, if we recall at some of our earlier presentations, there were different imperial notions of what could happen. We talked about the Husayn-McMahon correspondence, that is, that an Ottoman official, Husayn, the Sharif Husayn of Mecca, who had sort of been appointed by the Ottomans and was in charge of running the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina, and taking care of the sort of sacred spaces there, that he had sort of gotten a little bit nervous that he was on the outs with the Ottoman government. And in order to secure his position, he made a deal with the British diplomat, McMahon. And McMahon said, hey, we will help support a revolt, and in exchange, you will get a state, an Arab state afterwards, right? And so Hussein and his sons, Faisal and Abdullah and Ali, all helped create this revolt in combination with the British that would lead to an internal uprising within the Ottoman government and a new front of the war, right? And this would help the British take pressure off British control and so on. There had been that, and then there had also been, as we recall, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was that Mark Sykes from the British side worked out something with Georges Picot about like a split between French and British control over the Middle East. They were carving all of these kinds of things up in the background. Towards the end of the war, then, there would be the end of the Arab Revolt, right? In 1918, at the end of the Arab Revolt, by that time, Faisal and his forces, in combination with the British and other forces, were able to push upward. If we go to the next slide, I think there's maybe the next one. Maybe the next. All the good that had sort of been pushing up forward, up from this area here. Remember, he comes from the Hijaz, pushing up through Aqaba and into Damascus. So that by the time we get to October 1918, he's able to, he and his forces make their way into Syria, and control would get handed over. So he shows up. Now we can go back. I really didn't work through my slides like I normally try to. But so he comes back with his forces, and in 1918, and he says, you know, thinking that he's gonna get the benefit of this Husayn-McMahon correspondence agreement. The war comes to an end, and most importantly, I want to make one more notation about a document in the background, which is that on January 8th, 1918, Woodrow Wilson delivers his 14 points, his declaration of his 14 points, to the American Congress. And in so doing, he highlights a couple of ideas that will serve as the background, the basis for justifying Faisal's explanation for what should happen. Should there be a national state? Should this be an independent state, and so on? So some major principles from that, from Woodrow Wilson's perspective, are that the war, World War I, was a war that came about because of these quiet, underhanded agreements that nobody knew about. That they also came up as a result of colonialism, and that self-determination of nations was a principle that should drive post-war settlements, and that finally there should be this like League of Nations that sort of prevents these kinds of things from going on. So that idea of the self-determination of nations was one that many countries, or many sort of former colonies or ethnic groups that were in some of these larger empires, would pick up on and run with them, like as the basis for we should have our own state. And so when we get to like the Treaty of Versailles and the post-war settlement, countries or places, groups, ethnic groups from all over would send delegations to the Treaty of Versailles in order to justify the idea that they should have their own state. One of these would be the WAFT, the delegation from Egypt that goes and says we should have an independent state. There would be any number of these groups sort of vying for recognition as an independent nation separate from the empires that they were connected with previously. So Woodrow Wilson has put that idea out there. Meanwhile, Faisal and his crew had sort of marched their way up to Syria. They get there at that point, when they get to Syria in, I think it's October, but I'm going to say it wrong. I'm going to double check my dates. I have to read my own handwriting while I do that. So when they arrive in May, right, when they get to, no, sorry, October, I was right, don't second guess myself. When they get to October in 1918, the Arab forces march up into Syria. By that time, the Ottoman general had already handed over control, he said, to a group, like some Damascus notables, some leading families, and said, you guys hold on, you're in charge until somebody else gets here and takes control from you. They're the Al-Jaziris, an important family in Damascus. And then the next day, Hussein shows up, and T.E. Lawrence, who had been the British diplomat who'd been sort of helping the Arab revolt along, comes along and says, hey, hand over the keys to the city and give them over to Faisal. And so Faisal arrives in October 1918. Damascus sort of surrenders officially, and he's going to be in charge. At the moment of the handover, the Al-Jaziris, who had sort of been these mediators, declare their loyalty to the idea of a Syrian state or of an Arab state, whatever it is that Faisal is going to be putting into place. And ta-da, it's all easy and smooth going, right? Everything's fine. No, so part of what happened was that actually Faisal marches into a really complicated political situation. There had already been a number of important families in the city of Damascus who all over the years had exercised various forms of political and economic and social importance, and more or less run Damascus. You have similar kinds of families, leading families referred to as notables, up in other major cities in Aleppo. You have major families in Jerusalem who are kind of running things on their own, have always sort of been like the leading guys. And who are coming out of this Ottoman tradition of autonomous rule and their kind of patronage that they were familiar with. You also have Faisal coming up with a bunch of people who were not necessarily overtly nationalist in the modern sense, but were calling for independence and some sort of level of control themselves. Many of these men that had supported Faisal came from Greater Syria and Iraq. Some had come from the Hejaz, and so they had their own idea of what this state would be, and that Faisal was their leader that they had followed and should be the leader of whatever this state is going to be. In addition to the autonomous Ottomanist kind of ideas that existed before the war, and this post-war thing where the Ottoman Empire no longer exists in Syria and people are just sort of trying to figure out how they're going to maintain power, you also have sort of this popular sense of not really knowing where or what kind of idea they wanted to follow, right? They had grown up as Ottomans. They had thought of themselves as culturally Arab. They were not organized politically into a modern nation state yet. Why would they have planned that? They were part of something else beforehand. During the war, the experience of war itself, the experience of occupation, the experience of the presence of Ottoman troops, there were famines, there were shortages, there were uprisings. And so at various parts of the period of World War I, young people in their 20s and in their 30s were thinking very seriously about and renegotiating their relationship both to the Ottoman Empire and to the rest of the world. Were they part of a local polity? Were they Jerusalemites? Were they Arabs? Were they part of this greater Arab state that could come into existence? And there's a book called The Locust Year that sort of is a translation of a young man in Jerusalem's diaries that he was keeping, where he talks about his sort of fluctuating relationship with the Ottomans, his growing disgust with the Ottomans, even as he's serving in the Ottoman army, his desire to be more of a humanist, or is he an Arab? His conversations with his old professor about the different possibilities that come about. So all through World War I, there's a lot of fluctuation about the ideas of what it is that people kind of want to believe in, and what they could aspire to see for their own kinds of futures. So none of this was neat. And here Faisal kind of steps into all of this as an outsider, thinking that, of course, there is this goal. They'd all been working together to liberate an Arab state. And that's been in his mind all through 1916 to so on. So it's fully formed. But he shows up in Damascus, and a lot of the local notables are like, yeah, we want independence from whatever it was, but we don't want to reorganize our lives and our power and give that up in the favor of whatever the state is. So he arrives, and there's a whole lot of confusion about who will benefit from the organization of the state and the reorganization of the state. A lot of the people from Damascus are trying to reassert their old order. Faisal's colleagues are trying to bring in new order and a new sense. And so they're hiring and picking out people from Palestine and Iraq to put into major positions of the newly forming government, which is alienating a lot of the Damascus notables. And that gets really frustrating. And Faisal didn't really expect to experience this level of frustration and this level of infighting. Here's great opportunity to create this new state. And so people are wanting regional representations. They're wanting autonomy from their major cities and from the different parts of the cities and the land itself, like from parts of Syria, from parts of Palestine. Everyone's coming with their own kinds of sense of what should happen. And so Faisal is getting to the point, as 1919 turns along, a year in power, trying to figure out how to hold all of these groups together and really struggling to do so. And among all of this infighting, we also get word, he gets word that the French are wanting to move in and take over and enact the Sykes-Picot agreement that they thought they had agreed to. And so he figures out that the best way to move forward with this is to call for a Congress where everyone comes together and demonstrates to the world that there is a unified polity that can come up with an agenda that says, hey, you all support our ideas and we can be an independent state. And so the Congress is born in, let's see, what date? I think it is June 6th, 1919. They held elections just before that. And as a result of those elections on June 6th, 1919, 89 people from various areas of Greater Syria arrived. This includes representatives from rural towns, from Bedouin tribes all throughout Lebanon, Palestine, and rural parts of Syria, as well as delegations from each of the major cities of Damascus, Aleppo, and then Hama and Homs in Syria. And they come together, and they are a little bit stymied for a while. Everybody's bickering among themselves, but eventually what they do is produce this resolution that calls for the declaration of a Syrian state that would be independent. And so we're going to walk through a few points that I wanted to kind of highlight that give us a sense of if we read it closely, give us a sense of the tensions that are at play, and also the possibilities of different kinds of arrangements that people were thinking about in relationship to the creation of the Syrian state. So we, the undersigned members of the General Syrian Congress, they assembled and they sign off on this on the 2nd of July, 1919, goes on. And I want to point out that they talk about delegations from the 3 zones, Southern, Eastern, and Western, demonstrating that they're representative, furnished with credentials duly authorizing us to represent, that is, they had these elections, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish inhabitants of our respective districts. So highlighting the multi-religious aspect of the people consulted. Now, they're already aware the Balfour Declaration is out there. Zionists have been moving in. They're aware of these kinds of tensions that we've covered previously. And so they're explicitly highlighting Muslim, Christian, and Jewish inhabitants of our respective districts, that we submit to the following aspirations of the people who have chosen us to place them before the American section of the Inter Allied Commission. That is, we're going to talk to the Americans and beg them, not beg them, but plead with them to recognize what we're asking. They're also aware of the mandates that had been issued and so on. And so as we flip to the next, we will see that there is an explicit discussion of what's going to be happening with the mandates. And here we can see Faisal leaving a Damascus administrative office shortly after having arrived. So I wanted to make sure we had a picture of Faisal and the Arab troops that he had arrived as he came into Damascus. So the next one. So they set forth in this a variety of specific kind of ideas. And the first of these I wanted to point out is that they desire an independent, absolute political independence for Syria. And they run off the various boundaries in descriptive form. This is sort of the close-up. They identify that where these rivers meet is where this would be the northern corner. They specifically refer to Gaza and Rafah as like the southern side of the Palestinian coast. They also kind of pull it out to this far to the east, to think about which direction I'm looking at here, going out this way. And then they also incorporate, as part of this in the broader picture, you can kind of see the swath of what this Arab state would have roughly looked like following those boundaries. So there is that. So let's go to the next. And this aligns pretty nicely with the Husayn-McMahon correspondence and what Sharif Husayn himself would have imagined that he was calling for. Here we have an image of Faisal, who was the son of Sharif Husayn, and who marched into Damascus prepared to take on his rule. And so a couple of things that I kind of wanted to point out here, again, not going over the entire text, but he explicitly talks about a desire for a constitutional monarchy. He's highlighting the idea that it's based on principles of democratic and broadly decentralized rule that safeguards the rights of minorities. Now, this is doing a couple of things. One, says an independent state in a government that would be recognizable to the West, but then also meets the jockeying for power, right? It sort of glosses over the internal disputes about autonomous control. That sort of helps to gloss over the confusion between the Damascus notables, the Aleppo notables, and all of these different groups who are jockeying for that. But emphasizing democracy. And it also says that Amir Faisal would be, who has striven so nobly for our liberation and enjoyed our full confidence and trust that he should be our king, right? So affirming this is the ruler, but we're going to have autonomy and so on. Now, the other thing that idea of autonomy does is it also preserves the Ottoman rule principle of autonomy within religious communities and Ottoman society. That is, up until the late 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, religious communities had a great deal of autonomy over their education systems, their legal systems, marriage, divorce, and all of those kinds of things. So this idea of autonomy both recognizes a certain amount of like that political decentralization and also religious and cultural identification that would allow people to feel comfortable and on board with this mission. The other piece is that it says that in fact, in view of the fact that Arab inhabitants of Syria are not less fitted or gifted than were certain other nations, right? That we want in the covenant of the League of Nations to not relegate us to sort of this kind of tutelage or semi-colonial expectation. So it's referencing that covenant of the League of Nations and the mandates that were being proposed to be created. It says, we have just as much right as we're able to get together and organize our principles as any of the other communities that have been granted independence, the Bulgarians, the Serbs, the Greeks, etc. We're not different from that. And that we are rejecting this idea that we as Arab people are insufficiently developed to be able to be recognized as our own state. So it's a recognition that they are being set aside as a different class of people and a rejection of that. We go to the next one. Don't worry about you can read it if you want to download the slides later. I just wanted to make sure the 14 points are there because this next one really hits at the American role and the expectations and the vision, which is quite different now from what the United States looks like in the Middle East. But at this moment, the United States was really held up as not having intrinsic interest in the region, not being the kind of power, colonial power, and imperialist power, but like this grace, the saving grace that could help if anybody needed help without necessarily wanting to take on the Arabs themselves didn't see the United States as wanting to usurp their power, right? And so it says that they regard that if the mandate has to be put forward, they don't think it has to be, that there should be, that we shall regard the mandate mentioned in the League of Nations as implying no more than the rendering of assistance. You can help us, like actually help us with technical and economic fields without impairment of our absolute independence. And they rely on President Wilson's declaration. They're explicitly referencing President Wilson's declaration and taking it very seriously that they should be an independent state ruling themselves. In our desire that our country should not be made a field for colonization, that is, colonies of the British and the French in particular, and our belief that the American nation is devoid of colonial ambitions with no political designs on our country, we only want help from the United States. We don't trust the rest of you guys. We can trust the United States to render us assistance without attempting to take us over. Okay, so if we go to the next one, there was one clause that they said they approved, that they agreed, all of the other parts, they agreed unanimously. There was one part that they only had a majority vote on, and it's this one, that if the Americans can't help them, they'll accept British help, but only for a limited time and in very limited case, right? And in many ways, that is a concession to Faisal's own need. He needed allies. He knew that he needed allies. He's an outsider in Syria coming from the Hejaz. So he knows he needs allies. They need a backup plan. And if they have to have a backup plan, let it be the British and not the French. They're already worried the French are going to be marching in, and they've got this relationship with the British that helped them with the revolt. So maybe it won't be so bad with the British. America first, maybe the British. Next, definitely not the French. No French at all, no part of anything to do with the French. Number 7 is this idea. They reject the claims of the Zionists for the establishment of a Jewish Commonwealth in that part of southern Syria, which is known as Palestine. And I want to reference this because there's a lot of discussion about there wasn't a Palestine in sort of discourse, in the fighting back and forth about whether Palestine existed or not. Palestine existed in the minds of people. It existed as a place that people referenced. And here we have in 1919 a reference to Palestine from the Arabs talking about this region in particular, being off hands to Zionist immigrants. So they reject the idea of the Zionists coming in and making Palestine their commonwealth or their national home. They reject that idea, but they affirm at the end that our Jewish fellow citizens shall continue to enjoy the rights and to bear the responsibilities which are in common. That is, they are asserting that it's not Jewish communities specifically. It is the Zionists who are not acceptable for this part of Palestine. And it reiterates those earlier principles that it is a declaration of the communities that already existed there, right? So there was this possibility in this moment. And this image here is actually a gathering on the Nadi al-Arabi, that is the club, the Arab club, which was a site of anti-Zionist sort of organization and political organizing within Damascus even before 1919. So questions and concerns about that were already existing. People were already organizing with the idea that Zionism was potentially harmful to the future of this Arab state. So if we go to the next slide, they say that they're already aware of this idea that Syria should be divvied up. And so in number 8, They say that there is no dismemberment of Syria and no separation of Palestine or the coastal regions that are Lebanon and so on. And so they are explicitly saying we want a whole and united greater Syria. In number 9, there was debate about whether or not Mesopotamia, that is Iraq, fits into this greater Arab state. And in number 9, they're saying that that's not the case. They're saying we don't necessarily want Iraq as part of this larger Arab state. Syria is fine, but that the state of Iraq should be an independent state, not under a mandate, and that they should be able to have economic and political relationships with one another. And so they're already thinking about what is the size of a state, what are the places in which there is a cultural integration. Iraq was sort of a frontier province of the Ottoman Empire. And so it was not as centralized, it was not as deeply economically connected to Greater Syria as the parts of Greater Syria were among themselves. And so there's a recognition of distinction between those. They delineate that Iraq is separate. And then the other one is in number 10. Once again, they are again calling on Wilson's principles and calling on the idea of like Western interference from Europe in order to frame what they're rejecting. So they're saying that they are the basic principles proclaimed by President Wilson in condemning the secret treaties cause us to say, you must undo the secret treaties you made. You must undo the Balfour Declaration and you must undo the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Those should be null and void on the basis of Wilson's 14 points. So they're very carefully thinking about how the diplomacy, how they can leverage American interference or America's role to undo what it is that the British and the French have been trying to do. And so we disagree with any dismemberment of Syria, and that we ask for a complete annulment of these agreements, such as the Sykes-Picot Agreement that went forward. And then the final piece is the next slide, that's the end. I mean, it's a fairly short declaration with a lot of meat to it. But in the end, they once again are referring to President Wilson and his principles as the basis for what they're doing. I mean, they are really trying to tie this up as closely as possible with what they hope will be their ally against imperialism. They look to President Wilson and the liberal American nation, liberal lower L, that is free, emphasis on free, American nation, who are known for their sincere and generous sympathy with the aspirations of weak nations. So this idea that America, the idea that America from the outside is not imperialist, is naive if we take a larger global look. I'm not suggesting that that's the case, but from the perspective of the Middle East, at this time, it's the one great power that has not tried to get its thumb in the pie here. And so that America, the ideal of America, the ideals of freedom, the ideals of a nation that made itself out of principles of self-determination as they see it, that this is the basis for the connection, the legacy that they're trying to make and to leverage. And it suggests that had this come together, I think, that there would have been a really interesting possibility for a relationship between the United States and countries in the Middle East that's vastly different from what we see today, right? It could have unfolded vastly differently, or maybe not, but it suggests that there was a possibility, right? We also fully believe that the peace conference will recognize that we would not have risen against Turkish rule under which we enjoyed civic and political privileges as well as rights of representation, had it not been that the Turks had denied us our right to a national existence. And that, so we wouldn't have done this if you guys hadn't convinced us we would do this, is my take on this, right? To ensure that our political privileges may not be less after the sacrifices of life which we have made in the cause of our freedom than they were before the war. To me, this reads, that my interpretation is like, hey, by the way, Britain, you're the ones that wrangled us into this. We threw our lot in with you. You promised us this stuff. We should not end up with something worse than we started off with. And at least under the Ottomans, there were civic and political privileges that they benefited from, right? And so we should at least have those and not less than that, given what we did in the effort to move these kinds of things forward, right? So what happened? Almost immediately after this, within months, France marched in and took over. Faisal, it's the French. I wrote it down because I'm not good at generals' names. Not an encyclopedia. General Jourot on 14 July comes in and says, you gotta figure out what you're gonna do. We're gonna come in. And Faisal ultimately agrees to more or less concede control to the general because he doesn't want, he thinks that in conceding, then the general, France won't occupy Syria, and that will allow time for a delegation to do something. And then he leaves, and the French do in fact occupy Syria. And there is no real meaningful delegation. He does go on to Versailles in an attempt to make the case that this should be undone, but that is rejected in favor of imposing the mandate system. So the Syrian Congress is both an expression of this kind of Arab identity, this sense of Arab identity and the formation of an Arab state. It's a statement of a possibility of a different kind of future should Syria have come into being as a state. Faisal would likely have worked closely with at least the Americans, but probably the British as well, right? Faisal had already developed that relationship. And that would have created an entirely different scenario in terms of what could have happened with immigration, the independence of a state. And I think that also the fact that at this moment there was an opportunity for the United States to establish allies in the region and develop partnerships suggests that there is something different. It really underlies the fact that there wasn't always this idea that the American government was an enemy of the people of the Middle East, right? There were ways in which the Middle East saw the United States as a potential ally, as a sort of harbinger of freedom. And it would be the Americans after World War II in particular who kind of undo that relationship with sort of overthrowing democracies in various parts of the Middle East. So there is this moment in 1919 where an entirely different way of arranging foreign relations and establishing the Middle East and its modern nation states could have taken place. And that's it. So I can take any questions.
US, so all of this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, but seeing the US anti-imperialist allies absolutely systematic, especially as you noted, America is very much